Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome Max Rollwage. He's a healthcare executive. Today's Kevin MD article is The Promise and Perils of AI in Healthcare, Why We Need Better Testing Standards. Max, welcome to the show.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to speak about this important topic.
All right, so let's start by briefly sharing your story and journey.
Yeah, so my background is in clinical psychology, and maybe it's helpful to say I'm working at the moment on building clinical AI and testing clinical AI at a mental health company. So we use AI to support patients and clinicians to make mental health care more accessible and more effective. So really, I think, every day, day in and day out, I really think about how can we use AI in a safe and an effective way to support and amplify clinicians in a healthcare setting. So that thinking obviously then means that you look around in the industry and the research that's coming out. And one thing that I found very interesting, or actually surprising to say the least, I guess, was then when you look especially at the big labs that bring out the frontier models, that there seems to be a disconnect between the great work they're doing of pushing the capabilities of these models. And I'm really enthusiastic about it because they're doing a fantastic job there. But then it kind of all falls down a bit when it comes to testing these models,
Yeah.
especially for very sensitive applications like healthcare. And that obviously bears massive risks. So that's kind of the reason why I wrote this article, to explore how good the testing of these models is to date, and where we as an industry might need to improve in order to make sure that really we push innovation forward in a responsible and safe way.
All right, so let's talk about that. You, of course, talk about that in your Kevin MD article, The Promise and Perils of AI in Healthcare. For those who didn't get a chance to read your article, tell us more.
Yeah. So the article was triggered by a bunch of research and, I guess, general media attention coming out for what seemed like breakthrough approaches in clinical AI in healthcare. And specifically, I wrote the article when the OpenAI Health Bench came out, because there was a lot of noise around this, basically, along the lines of the feeling that in a few moments we would have AI doctors treating patients
Yeah.
everywhere and in the real world.
And then for those who aren't familiar with Health Bench, tell us exactly what that is so get people up to speed.
Yeah, so ultimately, a lot of these leading AI companies have done research where they have taken some form of test where they simulate patients and show that the AI can perform at the same level as a human, or even beyond a human level clinician. Now, the problem that I discuss in this article is really that these tests are very artificial.
Mhm.
So take as an example this health bench. What really is, it's like 5,000 use cases across all forms of medicine, where clinicians have drafted simulated patient interactions, and then they see how a generative AI model would respond to that interaction. This is then graded by other AI models for the performance on these 5,000 cases. So the problem that I see here is, on the one hand, 5,000 cases is a good starting point. But if you think about the whole variety of all the medical fields and real world complexity of patients,
Yeah.
it's only like a drop in the ocean. Like, it really doesn't capture all the ways in how patients might interact with AI. The other bit that I think is quite important as well is these approaches are a bit circular. If you have AI evaluators evaluating, the performance of an AI doctor, you kind of get into this circular conclusion where we're trying to establish, is AI good enough for healthcare and safe enough for healthcare? But then we're relying on AI to give us the answer. So, these were kind of a few things where I was like, I can understand why this is the approach that leading companies are taking, because it has proven in the past well for improving their models. That's kind of the engineering approach they took. I do think there's a big difference between that and the safety approach, the clinical testing that you need to do in order to bring something like this into the real world, really.
And I'm seeing that a lot of these new iterations of AI models, they're specifically geared to pass these benchmarks, right? Whether it's health bench, and there are a variety of benchmarks. And whenever the latest and greatest AI model comes up, they always say that they're the best in these benchmark. And it leads to the suspicion whether these new models are just being trained to meet benchmarks, like teaching to the test, so to speak.
Exactly. I think that's exactly the reason why these companies are doing that, so that they can train models on a ground truth. But that is, a real question. And, I'm very critical of this, where that translates to the real world. So, as an example, just speaking a bit from my own experience in building AI for patient-facing care, one of the things you experience is patients behave in a very different way than you would expect. Like if you only have like these 5,000 simulated cases, I guarantee you a patient will surprise you with interacting with these AI agents in a way that you didn't anticipate, that there might be ways of it falling over that you didn't have in your limited benchmark test case, right? The other thing, as I mentioned, I think at this point where we're still trying to establish whether AI is good enough for clinic practice, really human clinicians can only be the only ground truth to evaluate how well
Mhm.
are these AI models doing. And then the final thing, which I think is really, really critical, which I see way, way too little, is ultimately there's on the one hand seeing whether the AI gives a good response, like, based on objective criteria.
Mhm.
But ultimately, what we really care about, I think, is what is the impact on the patient, right? Like, and that is only possible by doing real world kind of clinical studies of seeing in a controlled setting, having users interact with these models and see, A, is it effective in the long run, like through, for instance, RCTs on clinical outcomes, and is it safe? And again, I think there is really like this disconnect between a very engineering focused way of building these models, which benchmarks are a great way for, but I think we really need to bridge it into a more clinical application step to make sure that these models really are safe and effective in the real world.
And then when you say that these AI models are being used in clinical settings, how are they being used? Are they being used in decision support? Are they using chatbots, patient-facing chatbots? How are these AI models being used clinically that concerns you so much, the way they're being tested?
So one of the things I think that is the biggest concern in all honesty is for these big labs, a lot of the models are used just by users, in terms of, you know, as a substitute for a therapist. I think we recently, unfortunately, had a lot of media attention for all the kind of ways of how ChatGPT users, for instance, use these models for well-being support, which has often quite detrimental, effects. Similarly, I think you also see a lot of companies that try to use these models with a wrapper around for, yeah, kind of well-being therapy
Sure.
support, things like this. And don't get me wrong, like again, like I work for a mental health company, and I think there's tremendous value in using these models. Like, they really do get to a point when properly combined with the right safeguards and this right architecture that they can really amplify the healthcare system and really help patients. So I'm a big advocate for that, but it really needs a lot of thought of how you use it. Like as an example, in our company, we use it always in combination with a clinician. So as an example, that would be for intake and referral, which then kind of provides information to the clinician at assessment, or for kind of therapy adjacent support in combination with a human therapist. And the main and just to be clear again, like I do think in order to harness the power of AI, all these applications in the future will be applications that we should explore, right?
Sure.
It's more important just to stick to a high bar of rigor and quality, which means like really test the safety of all the features that you're building and then run these clinical studies, like, really, similar to drug development, I would say. It is only the very first step to test the compound of the drug that you have developed. I think that's kind of equivalent to where we at the moment with these benchmarks. We have kind of done the very first step where we kind of in principle, we have shown that these models could do something interesting, but now need to go into phase one, phase two, phase three trials to see, if you release these in the real world, is that is it kind of feasible, effective, and
Sure.
safe to do?
So you mentioned using kind of like the rigor of the FDA and drug and clinical trials before we can use it for clinical applications of AI. Do you ever worry that it's going to be too expensive or take too long to measure, and that's going to slow down the innovation of these AI models that are iterating so quickly? So where do you find a balance there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, like in all honesty, I think about this again every day. So as an example, I have the experience of regulating a mental health chatbot as a medical device, which at that point, or I think until now, is the only mental health chatbot that is a medical device. So I know what effort it takes, and I completely agree. It takes a lot of effort. As an example, in order to do that, we produced like 10,000 pages of safety documentation of the behavior of these models and run three large-scale real-world studies with like hundreds of thousands of patients. So it is effortful, I agree. However, on the flip side, if you see the alternative would be to basically fly blind, to just be like, okay, let's deploy these models and just see what happens. And unfortunately, as we see, there is, especially in the mental health space, I think a large latent demand for utilizing these AI products. And that happens often right now in an unregulated way because people just go to ChatGPT as an example to utilize that as their counselor. And the consequences, I think, are unfortunately piling up right now, as we see in the media.
Sure.
I personally don't think that that alternative is more appealing for society and yeah, for every individual as well using these products.
So that scenario that you describe, flying blind and just releasing these products and then seeing what happens, that's pretty much the way Silicon Valley thinks, right? That's the way these technology startups, they just release things and see what happens and then they just iterate to the next model. How do you get them to take notice of some of the clinical consequences of that approach? Do you see companies like OpenAI and the various startups slowing down because of the consequences? Because that's not part of their DNA.
Yeah, I mean, like in all honesty, I can't really comment on OpenAI. That like I'm not certain what their policies is. I can definitely see companies in the more applied clinical space doing the right thing. I think it's more in their DNA, often having kind of more clinical and researchers on staff. I think that's critical to kind of bring that evidence-based thinking into building products. And again, that's something for myself that I find very important in this form of innovation. The other aspect that I think people don't, it's nearly seen as a bad word, but I think regulation and oversight
Mhm.
is something I personally really am quite passionate about. I think there's a real critical time in history right now where kind of a collaboration between institutions like the FDA, or there's also these non-regulatory bodies like the AI safety institutes, which have been
Mhm.
built in the US and in the UK, where they can play a role to, work together, I think, with industry and agree on maybe ways of testing safety that is not as burdensome as it's always seen. And in reality, like, that kind of testing, it is, I think, getting a bad rap, but it really, really, really is the rational thing of how you ensure that you're doing the right thing, right? So, I really think bringing these different policymakers and the industry together is something that I would love to see because I think that's kind of the way of how we can solve that and harness the potential by not like stunting the innovation.
So, what kind of regulatory initiatives are, to your knowledge, going on, whether in the US or the UK? Is the government getting involved in these potential AI safety initiatives?
Again, I can only speak from, the parts that I see in my world.
Yeah.
These regulators definitely have a lot of interest in working together with industry. And, we collaborate as an example with these safety institutes as well as with the regulators to figure out what is the best path forwards to straddle exactly that balance. And I think personally, from my experience, I do think they're doing a very good job in being open and trying to get that dialogue going. And yeah, I very strongly believe that that is the way forward.
We're talking to Max Rollwage. He is a healthcare executive. Today's Kevin MD article is The Promise and Perils of AI in Healthcare, Why We Need Better Testing Standards. Max, let's end with some take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
So I think the take home I would like to deliver is we are at a time where AI has fantastic capabilities. And I really truly believe there will be great advantages in healthcare delivered by AI. But currently, our testing approach for making sure that AI is safe and effective lags quite behind the capabilities that we see. I think the one thing I would like to avoid is that clinicians think that AI is unsafe or scary. That's not what I'm saying. I think what I'm saying is there is ways of implementing AI in a safe way. It is more that the industry in general needs to start to adopt these high standards to really make sure that the products that we are using are tested and evidence-based.
Max, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.